Hey Prodigy, this is Mr. Jeremy. Today we're going to be talking about the three foundational shapes, circles, squares, and triangles, and how we can use our mind's eye to translate them into the visual arts from everyday objects and things we see around the world. These are going to, again, serve as the foundation for all of the building blocks for what we're going to come up with using our visual arts. All right, so exploring our basic shapes, we've got our circles, squares, and triangles. The biggest difference between these are what they do as far as combining together and what we can do with them and how they can show different structure in our illustrations. One of the biggest things is balance. With anything, any object, there's a certain balance to it. There's a center to this and where it sits on the world. A circle is very malleable. You can squash it into like this bean shape. You can stretch it into more of an oval shape. But one thing that always is consistent with a circle is the fact that it kind of rolls around within the plane of its existence. You can rotate it around in all these different shapes and on all these different forms by squashing, stretching, rotation, but it's always going to be this malleable entity. The nice thing about squares is they are always going to be the opposite from a circle, whereas they are always structured. Nice, tight, flat. They are always going to be solid. A nice thing that a square represents is strength and solidity. That means that it doesn't really rock around much. It's got a nice strong foundation. It's even throughout most of the time. Even if you have a rectangle standing up, it's still got that nice solid foundation. It could tip one way or another depending on how the plane moves, but it's more dependent on the ground itself than the structure of the shape. And again, you can stretch these out into longer rectangles. You can kind of play with the shape a little bit by creating a little bit more of a prism, but that gets into exactly what a triangle becomes. A triangle is nice because it is the balance between both circles and squares. Whereas this way, the triangle has a nice solid base. It's much like that square where it's very strong on the bottom. If we were to flip that upside down, we can see that now this triangle can kind of rotate back and forth. It's not as balanced. It's much more like the circle, even less so in the way of balance. It's got all this space to kind of tumble over, and we can get into some really fun dynamic movement when we're talking about cartooning or illustration with the use of triangles. Triangles are a little bit harder to see in everyday life too. When you're trying to break down objects and turn them into illustration, they're kind of hidden, and they're usually combined with other parts of our shapes and trying to figure out where they are. For instance, a soccer goal is a square, but then it's got a triangle to help hold it up. And again, that's that balance. Because it's going to be stronger that way, we can kind of see that in more of a three-dimensional space. And then you've got your little net on here. So you can see how combining these shapes together, you can really see where they exist out in the real world. And that's pretty much it for basic shapes. We'll get into some more intricacies later on and why these are important, how we can find them, and how we can build off of them.